Hello, everybody. Welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, over 110 speakers. As Al Pacino would say, wow. What have we got coming up? I'm glad you asked. Tomorrow, we have at 11 a.m. Critical Theory in the 21st Century with Amy Diath, Chris O'Kane, Werner Bonfeld, and Christian Lotz. At 5 p.m., counterinsurgency policing, a topic I wish we didn't have to cover, but given the nature of America at this moment, it will be a perennial, I'm sure. We have Omedio Chiang, Paul Passavant, Stuart Schrader, Travis Harris, Paige May, Samantha Pre-Gonzalez, and Charmaine Chua as the moderator. Debt After Graeber is on Friday at 11 a.m. That has Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee Claire LaBerge, and Andrew Ross. And at 3 p.m., What Just Happened? A review of the last year through the eyes of Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Thea Francos, Idris Robinson, and Nikhil Pal Singh. Neither Settler Nor Native at 10 a.m. On Saturday morning. Mahmoud Mandani, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and Samara Esmer with Ted Swedenberg as the moderator. And then at 11 a.m. on Sunday, May 30th, Rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alessandro Russo, Andrea Piazzaroli Longobardi, Chris Connery, and Asad Haider. You've got to work on your Italian to work for Red May. Finally, at 5 p.m. on Sunday, May 30th, we have Feminist International, How to Change Everything with Veronica Gago, Michael Hart, and Kathy Weeks. You can find all of these things and blurbs about them if you want to know more information on our website, www.redmayseattle.org. You will also find a button that says donate, and we hope you press it because we do not get any institutional funding. Not a lot of funding from institutions for commie festivals in the USA. But your generosity, the kindness of strangers, as we say, helps us get along for our 5th year now. And so to do a 6th, which we really want to do, press donate. You're going to be a Patreon member at $3, $5, $10, or $20, or you can go to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May. You can also find a link to the donation, to all the donation possibilities in our YouTube description of this particular event. But without further ado, I want to introduce the moderator and the gatherer together, the lefty whisperer who put together this this particular panel. It is, of course, Red May's own unique good luck charm, Asad Haider. I say that because Asad has been part of every Red May, and we feel that if Asad is not part of it, it will fail. I know he's a little mad at us because we promised him a general strike in the 3rd year and we haven't delivered yet, but we're working on it. Asad, you know, of course, is the co-founder of Viewpoint Magazine, an essential resource online, and the author of the recent book from Verso, Mistaken Identity. Asad, welcome back to your perch at Red May.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks everyone for joining. We have a great panel. Unfortunately, Gavin Walker won't be able to join us for family reasons, but I'll try to bring in some of his ideas a little later. He did write as an introduction to this issue of positions politics called Marx, Asia, and the History of the Present, which you can look up and find a lot more material along these lines. He wrote in the introduction that Marx here would not be situated simply at the level of a master signifier, but as the beginning of an open question. What possibilities are there in our moment for a reflection on Marx, on Asia, or Asia as a figure of discourse? And what of the relation of Marx and Asia, Marx in Asia, Marxism as a mode of comprehending the actuality of Asia in the contemporary moment? What broader theoretical reflections on time, history, the becoming of capitalism, the possibilities of politics in our era, and the fleeting object of analysis that is the present, can this relation open up? Which Marx do we need today? What politics of history, of the present, of the world? All of these contributions attempt to assist a renewed thinking of these questions across the landscape of the historical present. So this characterizes the talks that we're about to hear. Gavin, of course, was the author of The Sublime Perversion of Capital, which you can find. And speaking today, we have Ken Kawashima, who is the author of The Proletarian Gamble, Korean Workers in Interwar Japan, and the co-editor of the Tosaka June Reader. And forthcoming, he has done a translation of Kozo Uno's Theory of Crisis, which will be coming out from the Historical Materialism book series at any moment. And then we have Rebecca Karl, who is also one of the primary people of Positions Politics. You can find it at positionspolitics.org. Also works on the Critical China Scholars, which is also criticalchinascholars.org. She's the author of Mao Zedong in China in the 20th Century World, which is the first book I recommend to anybody who wants to know about Mao or the Chinese Revolution, and more recently, China's revolutions in the modern world. And so we're going to start straight away with Ken.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Asad, and thanks to all the Red May organizers for their great organization and planning and vision. And it's, yes, really too bad Gavin couldn't be here. Gavin Walker, this is his book, Sublime Perversion of Capital. And I guess just one thing I just wanted to say that has really influenced me from Gavin Walker's work, which kind of resonates with that opening paragraph you read, Asad, is I guess something that Gavin has really taught me is how even within Marxist discourse and within Marxist, the milieu, we could say, of Marxism itself has to still overcome what we could call this problem of Orientalism, which is this ideology that says that Europe is the authentic province of Marxist theory, and that tends to view Asia and this kind of relatively backward area of the world where Marxist theory doesn't really happen, but it's rather the place where Marxist theory should somehow be applied. I think Gavin's work really categorically stands against that approach, and he discovers all these incredible Marxist theorists from Japan, especially like Uno Kozo, or Karatani Kojin, or Hiromatsu, or Tosaka, or Yamada, and the list goes on and on and on. That's, I think, a really basic thing that I wish we could also talk about. But now to move to what I actually prepared, I wanted to first thank Asad and Gavin and Rebecca, whose research and teaching and friendship has taught me so much about Marx, Asia, and history. And, you know, if there's one thing I want to thank them for is that they've all helped me to correct and to overcome a certain error in my thinking that originally came into being in relation to how, on a general level of social and political consciousness, I was somehow supposed to identify with being a minority or with being Asian or Asian American or Japanese Korean American. So what I finally learned after many years of confusion, basically, is that this kind of mode of identification is not only a symptom of what we could call an imperialist Oedipal complex, but to also borrow from the title of Asad's great book, it is simply a mistaken identity. So even though Gavin has taught me, you know, for example, when we talk about Orientalism within Marxism, it's not simply to say, you know, to kind of posit Asia as this essence, which is what I somehow have been forced to be my entire life. And Assad's book really opened the way for me to think of this as a mistaken identity, which is an error that prevented me from grasping the truth not only of class struggle, but also of my own subjectivity, whose truth resides truly in what my body and my mind can do, the truth of my labor power. But the paradoxical thing about labor power, what Marx called labor power, is that its truth in me can only be actualized through work and through cooperation with other workers who all have naturally different and unequal laboring capacities and potentials than those of mine. Thus, we are all equal with each other because we are naturally unequal with each other in terms of our singular labor powers. But for this reason, we must treat each other as equals and behave as equals because we need to cooperate with each other in work for survival and for the protracted struggle against the despotism of capital and the ruling classes. So what I really want to talk about, though, are two problems that I think are very important for Marxist research and for labor movements. And these are problems that I think are also crucial for articulating the historical conditions of what we could call the revolutionary transition from capitalist society to communist society, a transition, moreover, that arguably must be led by what Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and W.E.B. Du Bois all called a dictatorship of the proletariat. So, two problems. The first problem pertains to the political organization of workers who are not only currently employed, but also who are unemployed or semi-unemployed or semi-employed. Because in my research on the situation of Korean workers in Japan during the 1920s and 30s, this question of how to especially organize unemployed workers was a huge and largely unresolved problem, one that was exacerbated by existing challenges in organizing employed workers in factories, as well as in the day labor market and in the construction and mining industries, which were constantly on the move. Moreover, organizing unemployed workers frequently turned into problems of nationalism and national sentiment, which prevented the creation of lasting class solidarities between nationalities, for example, among unemployed Japanese and Korean workers. Marx, therefore, here I want to turn now to Marx. Marx, therefore, was critical. He thought that it was critical for workers to cultivate a class consciousness and to think beyond national identity, and especially to understand how and why both employed and unemployed workers were cut from the same cloth, as it were, and how they were split and divided into separate and different spheres of social existence by capitalism's own methods of production. For Marx, it was essential that workers learn the secrets of how this division came about historically, and that we as workers cooperate with each other on the shared basis of our knowledge of these secret truths that Marx shows us, and that we invent techniques to overcome this division of the working class that leads to unnecessary competition between pure egos of individual workers and to the fragmentation of the labor movements overall. And today, of course, we know better now how so many ideological and discursive problems, such as the national question or the colonial question or the questions of race and gender, are found at the center of the capitalist normalization of the competition between workers. So how does Marx approach this problem? Of course, he shows us another problem of which we are not fully aware. Marx shows that the economic truth of this process that divides the working class has rather scandalously remained a secret of capitalist society, one that has been jealously kept away from the workers' awareness. And so a fundamental aspect of Marx's Capital was to expose the truth of this splitting process as an economic secret, and as if by a Promethean act of stealing the secret of fire from the gods on Mount Olympus, Marx stole the secrets of capital from the bourgeoisie, giving fire to the workers to unite both employed and unemployed workers as a unified class against the dictatorship of capital, and to transform this secret into public theoretical weapons of revolutionary critique. So what are these secrets and how did Marx expose them? This is a question of Marx's method in Capital, and to simplify greatly, we could say that Marx's analysis in Capital theoretically exposes two important secrets, as well as what we could call the double-sided truth of the capitalist mode of production, a double-sided truth in which the lived experiences of the employed and the unemployed workers represent two halves of a total combined truth of the capitalist mode of production. One half of this truth is related to Marx's path of investigation in Capital that leads to the secret truth of profit-making in capitalist production. The secret of profit-making, which is the first secret, is premised on the capitalist having successfully conducted or recruited a mass of workers from the sphere of circulation in the market and has brought them into the sphere of capitalist production. This conducting process, and this is a term Walker really emphasizes, conduire in French. This conducting process is based on what Marx called the sale and purchase of labor power as a commodity, which is a very alienating process of capitalist exchange, whereby the workers surrender their labor power to the capitalist as a commodity for a definite period of time to be consumed for its specific use value of producing value. And on this basis, the workers are led into the labor and valorization process where capitalists exploit these employed workers of their surplus labor time to produce surplus value and eventually profit distributed in accumulation. But in production, Marx says the workers work by extending credit to the capitalist, all the while being exploited of their surplus labor time. Marx's analysis of the exploitation of the workers' surplus labor time reveals the truth of how capitalism produces surplus value within capitalist production, thereby revealing the secret of profit making. The secret of profit, however, is tied to another secret of the capitalist mode of production, which takes us to the other half of its truth. So the other half of the truth that Marx's theoretical exposition in Capital clarifies is that the capitalist mode of production inevitably and cyclically produces the economic phenomenon of crisis, and that in the wake of crisis and amidst the accumulation phase of depression, this mode of production will also inevitably create what Marx called a relative surplus population of unemployed workers. He calls it this technical name because it is a surplus population that has been produced in direct relation to capital's own composition inside production. Yet at the same time, this relative surplus population of unemployed workers is distinctly positioned on the outside of capitalist production. So here we note the boundaries and limits of the rules of capitalist production, the limits of its dominant scale. Now, from his analysis of the scale of capitalist production, Marx, as it were, theoretically transposes his analysis to the question of the formation of the relative surplus population within capitalist accumulation. And we could say that in making this theoretical transposition, Marx's analysis shifts from the major and dominant key of capitalist production and into what we could call capital's position of the relative minor in the key of labor power and in the forms of existence of the relative surplus population. So this relative surplus population is a capitalist social phenomenon that is condemned to occupy the position of being capital's relative minor outside the immediate scale of capitalist production. And through the production of this relative minor position of the relative surplus population, the capitalist mode of production divides the working class into employed and unemployed workers. so important is this mechanism of splitting the working class into employed and unemployed workers that Marx granted it the special status of a fundamental economic law. He called it the law of populations peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. And he writes, quote, "The working population produces both the accumulation of capital and the means by which it itself is made relatively superfluous. This is a law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production." End of quote. For Marx, this law represented, quote, "the secret of why it happens that the more the workers work, the more alien wealth they produce, and that the more the productivity of their labor increases, the more does their very function as a means for the valorization of capital become precarious." End of quote. So for Marx, the secret of the law of populations had to be directly politicized so that the employed and unemployed workers could gradually come together politically and morally as a class and in a combined truth and in revolt against the dictatorship of capital. And this combination held the secrets of how to interrupt the methods of capitalist production, but also to disturb, he says, sorry, to disturb what Marx called the pure action of the sacred law of supply and demand. And this is the last quote from Marx, if you'll indulge me. Marx writes, "As soon as the workers try to organize planned cooperations between the employed and the unemployed in order to obviate or to weaken the ruinous effects of this natural law of capitalist production on their class, so soon does capital and its sycophant political economy cry out at the infringement of the eternal and, so to speak, sacred law of supply and demand. Every combination between employed and unemployed disturbs the pure action of this law. But on the other hand, as soon as in the colonies, for example, adverse circumstances prevent the creation of an industrial reserve army, and with it, the absolute dependence of the working class upon the capitalist class, capital rebels against the sacred laws of supply and demand and tries to make up for its inadequacies by forcible means." And this makes up for its inadequacies by forcible means. This is related to the second problem I would like to talk about, which is not only about these forcible means in the colonies, but more broadly about how we define the proletariat. In the passage I just read, Marx only parenthetically mentioned the history of colonialism, but from the perspective of the history of colonialism, where these forcible means are so clearly visible, especially in the capitalist stage of imperialism led by finance capital, this history additionally shows us that the proletariat cannot be defined simply as a class of wage labor that is exploited in capitalist production. Rather, the definition of the proletariat also implies a mass colonized population that is expropriated and separated from the land in so-called primitive accumulation, and that is driven as a result of this separation from the land to sell labor power as a commodity and to become a wage laborer, typically by migrating to centers where capital is concentrated. Especially in the big cities, this expropriated mass from the countryside comes to coexist alongside an already existing ocean of unemployed workers who have been produced periodically and in the wake of inevitable capitalist crisis as a relative surplus population. So now we can start to imagine an inevitable encounter between these two elements: the unemployed class of workers who have already been expropriated, and secondly, an expropriated mass who has yet to be exploited as a class of wage labor. Like two rivers, they converge outside of capitalist production, but it is here when we start to consider how these two rivers can be combined into a revolutionary convergence, or else how they can be separated and segregated for the service of capital. On this specific point, it is absolutely necessary to undertake more concrete and historical analyses of how, in this uneasy and turbulent whirlpool of surplus populations, both elements either form lasting solidarities in opposition to capital or else fall into competition against each other, which only works to capital's advantage. My own research, historical and theoretical research, has shown that a revolutionary convergence of these two elements is always possible, yet its actualization has been historically and consistently been blocked, segregated, and separated time and time again by state and parastate apparatuses of capture. These separations are thus never natural or automatic, but are carried out by the historical work of the ideological and repressive state apparatuses, as well as by biopolitical apparatuses of capture, and especially through a vast proliferation of discourses of nation, race, and gender. The important point, however, is that the work of these discursive productions of difference all work to ultimately compensate for capital's fundamental and ontological lack of labor power as a given commodity. But the problem that we face, especially today, is that this historical materialist production of difference has been naturalized to such a degree that workers are often driven, often unconsciously, to compete against each other as if by a sacred law of supply and demand, as if by a Darwinian natural selection of winners and losers. This then creates conditions for the modern perversion of the mass submission to capital. And instead of asking the revolutionary question of how to overthrow the dictatorship of capital in class struggle, the question is grotesquely distorted into a question of who will have the privilege and right to have their labor power bought as a commodity and be exploited as a class, and who will accept the position of being capital's relative minor. So I'm wrapping up here. So these two problems I've discussed, I think, boil down to differences between two problems: capitalist exploitation on the one hand and capitalist expropriation. How are they necessarily then related to each other? And how do both of these processes constitute our very subjectivities and identities? Here, the work of Uno Kozo is extremely helpful on this point. First of all, he says that the sale and purchase of labor power, or the commodification of labor power, is a founding process of capitalist society that marks the end point of the process of expropriation. At the same time, this process of the commodification of labor power is the starting point for capitalist exploitation. So as a pivotal point, the commodification of labor power is extremely charged, and Uno says that it reveals capital's fundamental contradiction. And what is this contradiction? As Uno repeated, literally like a mantra for Marxism, capital can only be capital by passing through a most peculiar contradiction and zone of impossibility at the heart of the capitalist mode of production. And this contradiction can be expressed in the following double proposition. On the one hand, capital cannot produce labor power as a commodity directly. On the other hand, capital must necessarily consume labor power as a commodity in order to produce surplus value and profit. Therefore, capital is fundamentally self-restricted in its own relation to labor power as a commodity and as an inevitable and ironic fact of its own commodity logic. Labor power is therefore capital's fundamental weakness, a fact of the greatest importance that clearly has to be radically politicized and overcome by a dictatorship of the proletariat. Since the 1960s, Marxist research has shown just how extensively the process of the commodification of labor power has been highly politicized, policed, racialized, gendered, and colonized. And I have emphasized how these specific mechanisms compensate for capital's lack of labor power as a given commodity, and how they maintain the basic splitting of the working class into employed and unemployed workers, and into the exploited and the expropriated. My concluding point is that to overcome the inequalities of racism, sexism, and colonialism that continue to plague contemporary capitalist society in the late stage of imperialism, in the era of empire, neoliberalism, and fascism, to overcome these problems of inequality that have long been maintained by the many state apparatuses as a means of policing a divided working class and of ensuring the endless commodification of labor power, I think it is necessary to not only interrupt, abolish, and destroy these ideological and repressive state apparatuses by a dictatorship of the proletariat, but also that the long process of critiquing and even smashing these apparatuses must also be guided by the basic principle that in the revolutionary and socialist transition from capitalist society to communist society, the commodification of labor power, first and foremost, will be negated and politically overcome once and for all eternity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And we'll go right ahead to Rebecca.
Hi, thanks for Red May for organizing. Thanks to Asad for moderating, Gavin, who's unfortunately not here, for organizing, and of course, Ken. I should always remember that I should never go after Ken. His rhetorical brilliance is never, I can never match it. So I'm just going to do what I do, which is what I do, and be happy with that. What I'm going to talk about today picks up a little bit from what Ken is talking about, although in not such lyrical or dire or even theoretical terms. The question I want to discuss today comes out of, which is about manifestos and feminism in China's Marxist encounters, comes out of some work that I did about a decade ago, published in 2013, a book of translated theoretical essays by an early 20th century Chinese anarcho-feminist named He Ying-jen. And He Ying-jen was a discovery that my co-editors and co-translators, Lydia Liu, Dorothy Ko, and I made together. And we decided to translate her work and to provide some comprehensive introductions and to put it under the title of transnational texts, essential texts in transnational feminism, because we want her to be Chinese, but we want her to be transnationally feminist as well. And we wanted to make that point. But in the course of our translations of this very important person and this very important theorist, who's been very much lost to history and lost in and to time. And so we wanted to restore her not only to her own time, but really mostly we wanted to have her speak to our time, because we thought very, very clearly that she was not. She much of what she was talking about had not been resolved by a long shot, and so we were interested in discussing her. In any case, one of the things that arose in our translations and in our systematic reading of He Ying-jen was this little detail that in the journal that she edited in called the Tianyi Bao, the Natural Justice Journal, in January 1908, there's a partial translation of the Communist Manifesto. And it's one of the first relatively lengthy translations from the Communist Manifesto extant in Chinese. And so we let it go while we were doing our work. But later on, it started to, as we were doing presentations about our work and so on, it would always come up. Did you know that the Communist Manifesto, the first Marx Engels full translation, was translated in the Tianyi Bao in this feminist journal? Isn't that interesting? And then I started thinking about it. What is interesting about that? I mean, why is it interesting? Is it just a negligible detail, or is it a detail that actually signifies, it says something, that means something? And so I started thinking, is it important as a theoretical and historical matter to note that one of the first ever translations into Chinese of Marx and Engels, this partial translation of the Communist Manifesto, was published in the feminist journal in the theory column? Is this then significant, or is it merely of minor interest? Is it just a footnote, or should it just be a footnote? And so while it's true that Marxism as a systematic mode of analysis was not systematically introduced into and did not take hold in China until at least a decade later, and it's also true that the import of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto was not appreciated in print, at least, or in organizational form until much later as well, at least a decade later. It's that the Communist Manifesto came into Chinese on the wings of feminism perhaps should not be treated as a negligible detail. Although then what does that detail signify? And so what I want to do today is just really try to think through out loud, as I do in my piece in positionspolitics.org, in the Episteme issue from which this is drawn, to think out loud about what that significance might be. I mean, why do we care? Why is this not just a footnote? And so in order to do so, I'm just going to do a little bit of historical clearing in order to be able to talk about this a little bit more clearly. But so that the first translations into Chinese of parts of the manifesto were done by Zhu Zhixin, and Zhu was an early associate of Sun Yat-sen, Sun Dongshan, and a founding member of the then revolutionary party called the Tongmenghui, the Revolutionary Alliance, in Tokyo in 1905. And then the translation that's in the Feminist Journal is by a man named, we think it's a man, Min Ming, whose pseudonym is irretrievable. We have no idea what identity, who he was, or what he was hiding. Okay, I'm assuming it was a he, just because often they were he's, these translators. Okay, but in any case, Zhu's effort was published in 1905, so 3 years before the Feminist Journal. And it was published and it was published in the Minbao, the People's Voice, which was the political organ, the print organ of the Revolutionary Alliance. And all that was translated there was part 2 of the manifesto, the 10-point program. Okay, the part which calls for the abolition of private property, the centralization of the state, the nationalization of industry and agriculture, education for all, and so on and so forth. Okay, and while we can't know why Zhu only translated that portion of the manifesto, we can suggest that he was most interested to offer a possible policy direction for a nascent political movement that was intent on seizing state power by overthrowing the Qing dynasty. That is, the 10 points appear to offer a possible blueprint for a new state project, and so it can be boiled down to some bullet points about what the new state might do. And Zhu remarks in his commentary, quote, "The simple desire of Marx to save the poor and ignorant mass of the people may be seen in this 10 points, okay, unquote. And he concludes, quote, Marx held the capitalists to be plunderers who pillaged and robbed. Their gains resulted from the exploitation of the workers, carried out solely for the purpose of fattening themselves. Okay. Of course, he didn't understand that to be rich is to be thin, not to be fat, but that's a different story. Without any further discussion of the document in the journal, we can see that in Minbao, the manifesto's content speaks to a functional method through which the weak or the impoverished can gain state power through their own mobilization. The poor against the fat and rich. Because it was inferred to be so narrowly functional and the 10-point program was presented as a set of potential state policies, Marx here was reduced to his applicability to China. And ultimately, the Revolutionary Alliance and Zhu Zixin, Sun Yat-sen, and so on all said, well, China's really not capitalist and therefore Marx is not applicable. And so then you can just throw Marx out. If it's just about applicability, you could just throw it away. And so to the extent then that the conditions of which Marx spoke for Europe were not apparently manifest in China in the same way, Marx could be and then was dismissed as irrelevant to China's particular situation by the Revolutionary Alliance and its theorists. Now, by contrast, shortly thereafter, then in 1908, the 1888 Engels preface to the English edition of the manifesto, as translated by this pseudonymous Min Ming, was published in Tianyi Bao in the 15th volume, the mouthpiece of the Chinese anarcho-feminist resident in Japan, He Yingzhen, and her husband, Liu Shipei. The Tianyi editorial comment at the end of the translated preface commends the piece as follows, quote, the Communist Manifesto, which is called in Chinese at this point, the Gongchang Zhuyi Xuanyan, discovered class struggle, which is a beneficial theory of history. From this preface, we can study the transformations in contemporary thought. Those who wish to study the development of socialism ought to begin here, unquote. Now, hopefully we can see almost immediately that by putting the Communist Manifesto in the realm of history and thought, we've taken it out of the realm of functionality and applicability. This comment then places the manifesto beyond the functional state program emphasized by Zhu's 10-point translation, and instead draws attention to the social process through which the state is clarified historically, that is, class struggle. Here, then, the manifesto is understood as a theory of history. It speaks not only to a particular European history, but to the problem of the modern historical condition itself. Indeed, in the subsequent joint issue of Tianyi Bao, the volumes 16 through 19, the introductory paragraph of the manifesto, which begins with the specter haunting Europe, as well as parts 1 and 2, were published in Min Ming's translation in their totality. Now, of most interest to me here is how the version published in Tianyi Bao in 1908 highlights the manifesto form, where the Min Bao excerpt does not. The 1905, that is, excerpt does not. Documents that are now translated as Xuanyan or manifestos, declarations, in other words, for example, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, were ambiguous in the late Qing. For example, which is the last decade, let's say, of the first decade, of the 20th century, lasting until the 1911 revolution that overthrows the dynasty. But so these were ambiguous texts. For example, the Declaration of Independence, which is now known as the Duli Xuanyan, was known in the early 20th century as the Duli Shiwen, a call to arms for independence. Okay, now this was first partially translated in 1901, and it was only much later, after the 1911 revolution, that is, that the Declaration of Independence came to be understood not only as a call to arms to oppose particular enemies, but as a declaration of a new kind of history altogether, a history of government by and for the people. And so the turn in the historical valence then is particularly important. So it's not just that the text was translated; it's that the valence of it changes. So as with Ju's translation of the 10-point program of the manifesto, the Declaration of Independence at first was understood as an activist policy statement to overthrow an unjust government, and not as an epistemological rethinking of history itself. And the same could be said of the Declaration of Rights of Man, but I'm not going to, I won't go into that. I'll just continue with the Communist Manifesto as translated by Min Ming for Tianyi Bao in 1908, participates in the genre of manifesto that is just then being established in China. This genre brings something new to the table. China was well known for having lots of petitions and so on, which is, a direct appeal to the state for the state to do something about it. The manifesto form, however, in the particular case of the Communist Manifesto, by presenting the introduction on haunting specters and parts 1 and 2, this is not merely a political program for state actors or would-be seizers of the state. Rather, it presents the possibility of a complete reconceptualization of the past in a new light. That is, as a genre, a manifesto announces a break with the now rejected past, whose reach into the present cannot be erased but must be reckoned with. The reckoning comes through a full engagement with the newness and the nowness of the present, an engagement with the question of what it is about this present that contains traces of the past, those ghostly specters, but is not mere continuation or attempted replica of that past. The reckoning with the past comes with an implied or stated set of hopes for a future not yet foretold. In other words, the future cannot be foretold from that past that is now haunting. It has to be reinvented, recreated, okay? And in this sense, it's historically significant that Min Ming's more full translation of the Communist Manifesto appears in the anarcho-feminist journal, Tianyi Bao, because the manifesto form, the very genre, which was so useful for Marx and Engels in their declaration of the spectral revolutionary era just then emerging into view, this form presents the possibility of reading the past as an open archive rather than a closed canon. As feminist theorist Kathy Weeks articulates, in this archival form, the past is neither sealed from the present, nor is the present a teleological result of an already known past narrated as history. Rather, perceiving the past as open archive enables a process that sees history as possibly transformative. It points then to reconceptualization, not recontextualization. That He Yingzhen, the editor of the Tianyi Bao, the anarcho-feminist, intended for her feminism to reconceptualize China's past and not merely recontextualize it, is clear from her essays such as On the Revenge of Women and others, all published in the journal. 女子复仇论 is the name of that essay in Chinese. Her commentaries and analyses do not revise the past as history, but they completely reread the past in feminist terms. Just a year prior to the Tianyi Bao translation of the Communist Manifesto, He Yingzhen had launched her journal with a feminist manifesto, through which she engaged a radical reconceptualizing of China's past in feminist perspective. In this inaugural piece, He Yingzhen thoroughly excoriates the marriage system, the married system, that is once man and wife, how men and women must relate socially, and the labor system within the family, where, as she notes, the word for fool, woman, and this requires a little bit of knowledge of Chinese characters, but that's okay, I'll just say it. The word for fool, woman, consistently is glossed as fool service. Those are their homonyms. And so but they're written very differently. And so She says, but the word for woman is always glossed as a form of service. So woman is always a form of service. Now, this is a fundamentally new idea. This is a rereading of what woman means through a reconceptualization and not merely a recontextualization. Heying's point then is not merely to indicate gender injustice, but to reread the Chinese and global past in an anti-patriarchal light so as to reformulate the bases for the present and a future, not just for women, but for humankind. Heying, at the same time as representing the past in feminist perspective, also engaged a vision of a future predicated upon social and cultural transformations, informed by a totalizing revolutionary overthrow of the historical and contemporary premises of an unjust and unequal patriarchal social order, one that was gendered, classed, domestically ethnicized, in other words, Han versus Manchu at that time, and globally racialized through imperialist practices of capitalist domination and legal control. As she writes in her manifesto, the goal of social transformation is not to grab rights for women so they can oppress men, but rather to attain and affirm the full humanity of all so as to find a way out of inequality and towards justice without regard to hierarchy or ancient custom. I won't go into the way she plays with words because it requires a lot of Chinese to do it, so I'll leave that out. But I just want to note that then, that read in this light, then, the fact that the fuller Communist Manifesto as a theory of history came as a feminist document in China is highly historically significant, therefore. Just as with Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto in content, also in form, Heying's Feminist Manifesto demands a reconceptualization of history in the future. This reconceptualizing is not merely inclusionary, rather it transforms what we see as historical, how we present the past as history, and thus the present as a source of possible futures. It is no coincidence then that the manifesto form became an oft-used genre for Chinese women and soon for radicals more generally from the early 20th century onwards to reconceptualize the present in light of rejected propositions from and about the past. My point then is that the manifesto form has to be seen not merely as containing a static content, but as representing in the present a past that does not lead to a desired future, but rather a past whose ghostly hauntings remain to be reckoned with as a new future is being made. In this light, then, Zhu Zixin's version of the Communist Manifesto, the 10-point program that is merely an instrumentalized document presenting a potential blueprint for state politics. This functionalist reading, what I would call, in fact, a masculinist one, becomes one primary mainstream fate of Marxism more generally in China. That is, how does a Marxism defined by known and static principles apply to the Chinese case? As soon as those principles are seen as inadequate or inapplicable to China, Marxism can be jettisoned. In its feminist rendering, however, the manifesto form and Marxism as a historical analytics can be seen as a method of rereading and reconceptualizing the past. It is an intervention into how to think the historicization of social relations and power dynamics in a totalizing and not merely state-led mode. In this version, Marxism remains a fluid dynamic, a set of possibilities, a way of recognizing and purging the inequities of the past and present in the name of a transformed future. It remains then enduringly relevant as a mode of reconceptualization and retotalizing, so long as the historical conditions to which it is connected and to which it responds, capitalism and the logic of global unevenness, subsist. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. And so now I just want to kind of stand in for Gavin Walker and read from an essay of his in the recent collection he edited called The Red Years on the Japanese 68, which is which just came out from Verso. And so this is from there's Ken's holding up the book. I don't know if you can see it. And this is from his concluding essay that I'll just read a little bit from. So he says, contrary to what Hegel, Engels, and Stalin thought, there are no laws of history, wrote Louis Althusser in a late unpublished note. Yet there are lessons of history, but these lessons are themselves aleatory. For the same situation, the same conjuncture, the same case never reproduces itself. This is a testament to the aleatory lessons of history, many still to be gained from the Japanese 68, lessons that can be derived precisely from the fact that no laws made them necessary developments. But those lessons themselves are shrouded in obscurity. We might even say that the lessons that can be given by the Japanese 68 are themselves obscure lessons whose teaching is neither obvious nor easy to grasp. What we have inherited is a received history and accomplished fact of 68, at least what we believe to be the reality of 68. But what we rarely have available to us is the educational encyclopedia that 68 is and was, a living historical entity that breathes and that can speak to us if we choose to arrange ourselves in such a way as to make it one part of our own lives. The greatest danger to the contemporary potential of 68 as thought comes not from its enemies, who have always hated an emancipatory politics, but from the center liberal false friends of the global 60s. These false friends remind us what a glorious time it was. We thought we could change the world. Ah, we were so young and naive. It is this melancholic disposition and affective structure of selective nostalgia that is the real enemy of the emancipatory aims of 68 as a still existing figure of thought. The sad passions in the Spinozist sense are best exemplified by the fascinated liberal, the respectable and decent intellectual who outsources their enjoyment to the excesses of 68, but who equally ensures that we never attempt to critically and affirmatively inherit 68 as our own problem. Thus, 1968 in Japan, or even the entire period of 1955 to 1973, characterized by a new left determined to make a revolution in their time, is a global story, and it is also our story. The Japanese 68 ought to be rescued from its interpreters, who make of it a trivial religious fable about the inevitable demoralization of excess, the passion and regret of the fanatic, or the centrist fear of audacity. In Japan and elsewhere, 1968 is not just some historical data or a fashionable aesthetic phenomena. It is a living reminder that politics is possible and that the overturning of the existing order is the only task of politics as such. Liberalism, in its contemporary global form, is the elimination of politics as such. The sheer domination of liberalism is evident not only at the economic level in its pursuit of free markets, but also at the cultural level, where resistance to the dominant order has largely been replaced with a primarily gestural politics, in which one is encouraged to say anything or affirm any identity within the social order, as long as there is a tacit agreement that nothing structural ever changes, eliminating the space of politics in favor of an enclosed game of affect and sentiment to which the force of capital is utterly indifferent. Alain Badiou has frequently invoked the formulation, disaster is better than non-being. Given the abyss of contemporary liberal identity politics and their full appropriation by capital and the state, it is surely better today to risk even disaster than the form of non-being represented by the liberal, census-driven parliamentary consensus for the eternalization of the status quo, a form of life, politics, and thought bereft of everything, even an idea. On March 31st, 1970, 9 members of the Communist League Red Army faction hijacked a domestic flight, Japan Airlines Flight 351 from Tokyo, taking the 129 passengers hostage and demanding passage to North Korea, which they hope to use as an international base for revolutionary work. 5 of the members, along with some of their partners, have lived in North Korea under unclear conditions since then. The group, whose primary members continue to reside in North Korea, surfaced and returned to the public eye in 2017 when a website calling itself the Yodogo Japanese Village emerged. Lately, there has been some interest in Europe and North America for the aftermath of the Odogo incident and its main protagonists, principally due to the emergence of the website of their small commune in North Korea. Ostensibly, it is a simple self-advertisement for a number of older people stuck in the Cold War period who would like to go home to Japan in their twilight years and who hope, therefore, for diplomatic normalization between Japan and North Korea. In this limited sense, it is not a particularly edifying or even interesting phenomenon. But what appeared to surprise people most when this site was circulated in the media was the fact that the website was not full of apologies or gestures of repentance for their participation in the struggle. Editorial commentary mostly noticed the members gave concise political histories of themselves, with simple explanations and nonchalant factual overviews. For example, influenced by the Haneda struggle and the deaths of activists at the hands of police, joined Red Army faction, participated in hijack action, presently in North Korea. At this point, there is little outcry against them, but perhaps more telling with regard to our current moment is the curiosity generated by their mere existence, and especially by their seeming lack of repentance. In general, it seems that the main interest in such histories is to simply give us the right to say with proud detachment, what weird people, they really believed in what they were doing. Clearly, the militants in the Yodogo incident mistakenly believed that individual acts of armed force could simply and directly spark world revolution. They had a tremendously naive conception of geopolitics. They had a substitutionist understanding of their own relative importance and political acumen. But that is not what causes such unease today. What causes unease in relation to them is the fact that they are not from another world, but from ours. Even after all this time, all this failure and defeat, there they are, on our same earth, reading, thinking, writing, living, wondering about what is to be done in this world we all inhabit. Perhaps we can say it was a strange choice they made, a terrible choice, a mistake. Definitively, it was at least a failure, although not a particularly bloody episode for the time, but it amounted to quite little. But what truly fascinates and makes them an object of curiosity is something else. The fact that seemingly they did not give up. Today, to not give up on a politics, even to not give up in general, is something totally pathologized by the generalized liberal consensus of all of our societies. The person who does not give up, who refuses to accept the new and decent status quo, who refuses to use the alibi of history to invalidate their youth or commitment, is a criminal, a lunatic, a fanatic. Instead, it is betrayal that is now normal. Our culture of capitalist triumph and liberal consensus tells us that you should betray your ideas and you should betray justice itself for the sake of development and maturity. You should betray your friends in the name of professionalism. Above all else, you shouldn't do anything extreme. If you do something extreme, you should adopt a new standpoint later, a standpoint of melancholy and inverted nostalgia for your ideas, all coupled to an overriding new notion that you were always already wrong because you were young. I think it is just the opposite, and we should uphold in broad terms the struggles of these red years not as a Pyrrhic victory, but as a defeat that must structure a new politics. Because there is functionally no difference between the world they rejected, of imperialism, racism, this rapacious and murderous logic of capital, of oppression against the liberation of peoples and nations, and our world. In fact, although we make every possible gesture to convince ourselves that it is not true, we actually live in the same world as them. This moment, its history, its sacrifices, its failures, should produce for us, in Yutaka Nagahara's terms, the exigency to deliver politics to this defeat. And to be able to make such a delivery, we must first refuse to exoticize these years of struggle as some simple cultism or collective delusion. Instead, we must stick to an old adage from the long global 60s. There is no guilt in revolution. To rebel is correct. That I cannot take credit for. It is Gavin Walker from the collection he edited, The Red Years on the Japanese 68. Now, we have questions of just some comments to think about all of these presentations and ideas together. we have very interesting progression from the analysis that Ken has provided of the logic of capital based on the formation of labor power, which progresses to the theory of crisis. And this is a very expansive point because, as Ken points out, it brings us to talk about the national question, the national and colonial questions, and to talk about all of the different social processes that are involved in the constitution of labor power on one side. You know, we can say that there is a process by which capital churns human material through its processes by generating labor power as a commodity, something which is not a natural condition. As Ken pointed out, it's presupposed by capital and it can't be made by capital. It has to be constituted by processes that are political, that involve various forms of domination. And it churns this human material out the other end as a surplus population, as the relative surplus population, which once again, as we know, is subjected to various forms of policing and control. Even the relative surplus population is not simply maintained on the basis of its separation from work. It's still actively controlled and constructed. We had very direct illustrations of this in the past couple weeks with the events in Gaza. We saw very clearly the national and colonial questions, and very clearly the way that a relative surplus population is controlled through military force, through colonial occupation, and through the racialization of this population. And it's a profound example of the way that these other processes of violence are fundamentally caught up in producing and controlling a particular kind of population. And what Ken also points to is that there is a complicated relationship between this, between what is constituted as labor power and the potential of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, that the dictatorship of the proletariat acts on the same human material which is constituted as labor power. It's the transformation of people who are reduced to being bearers of the commodity into the people who rule the society. And this is the fundamental kind of connection that is pointed to in this long tradition from Marx onwards between the social categories of labor power and the political potential of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which overturns that relation. But this is a very complicated relation between the social category and the political possibility. And this, I think, Rebecca has pointed also to this problem with the logic of the manifesto. And we see it already fundamentally in the Communist Manifesto with the claim that all of history is the history of class struggle. And this way that class is a historical category. It's a category which we use to understand the history of societies, and which is the history of unequal societies. That is, there is a thesis about the history of class societies, societies which have a fundamental basis in inequality and domination. And so class is a category we use to understand this history. But then at the same time, class is the basis for overturning an entire long history of domination into the possibility of a society without classes. And so the manifesto as a genre is it has a very interesting status because it declares that there is a specter, that the whole accumulated force of the past is here and it is in our present, but that is the basis on which we can forecast a society in which that, to use the terms of the International, we make a clean slate of history. The base of the world changes, we make a clean slate. And so the manifesto has this performative character of announcing what will have been the political process and the political subject that will completely transform the history that it has described as all of history. And so this is why the translation of the manifesto is such an important and conceptually interesting problem, because we already saw in Marx's own time, Marx confronting the problem of how does the account of the emergence of the capitalist mode of production in England apply to the world outside, apply to a world in which this transition already happened once and which now has come to subsume so much of the world into it. Marx addressed this with the case of Russia, about the possibility of different paths of history, different courses of development. He addressed it with reference to Ireland and the national and colonial questions. And what we're getting here in the case of China is just a very important question of the global translation of Marx and the global translation of emancipatory politics in the 20th century. How did Marx and Marxism come to be a set of ideas and practices that were not restricted to Europe, that could be translated, and that in translation transformed into something else? And so China is an interesting case in the sense that, Sylvain Lazarus talks about different modes of politics, historical modes of politics, and the first one is that of the French Revolution. And so the fact of the translation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man is also quite fascinating in this context. But the Communist Manifesto is the one that inaugurates the historical mode of politics, which is based around politics being located in history in the sense that they're historical laws that determine the emergence of emancipatory politics. That is what we get in the Communist Manifesto. And this ends with the Paris Commune, when the emergence of communist forms of life is aleatory and not the result of the unfolding of historical laws. And then we have the Bolshevik mode of politics, in which there is a condition for politics, not just historical laws, but the party as a condition which is distinct from the laws of history, which may determine classes as the basis of politics. So politics happens only under conditions. That's what the relevance is of the party. And then finally, Lazarus arrives at China for what he calls the dialectical mode of politics, which he identifies at the beginning in 1928 with Mao's account of political laws rather than historical laws. And the idea that rather than, as in the whole tradition, starting with the French Revolution, that there is the idea of this reversal in which state power is seized, that is subordinated in this military model to the control of liberated zones. And that suddenly there are political laws structured around controlling liberated zones. And so I was thinking about this idea of historical modes of politics, about the relationship between history and politics. And this is also the problem, this is why I chose this passage of Gavin's to read, because Gavin was really trying to capture, I think, the sense in which there is an affirmative character of politics which has to be asserted and is not simply given by social relations. It's not simply given by the existing historical process. And that in fact, this kind of politics is precarious, and it's fundamentally threatened by a certain kind of conception of history, which says that every instance before that we had of a politics that sought to overturn the existing order belongs to the past. You know, this is the question of the archive that Rebecca raised. Do we put it in the archive and seal the archives? There's some other conception of what it means to relate to this history of the emergence and eruption of emancipatory politics. So I'll leave my points there, and I'll bring in some questions we received, but I want to give.
Sorry, can I just ask one thing?
Yeah.
Sorry, Asad, and I don't mean to be niggly-piggly here, nor do I mean to be only the girl, but I did talk a lot about feminism and patriarchy, and that somehow got lost in your in your commentary. And I want to not be just the girl who talks about feminism. I want us to be very, very clear that Marxism came in on feminism, and that has to be the point. It has to be understood that the reconceptualization of history was feminist, anti-patriarchal, and Marxist at the same time. And I'm sorry if my point got lost there and that, or you didn't hear it. But I don't want to, I think you did a very nice encapsulation in a different mode, but I seriously don't want the anti-patriarchal aspect of the feminist rethinking of history to get lost here. I mean, I'm sorry to be insistent.
No, thank you.
I hate when I have to be the girl, but I'm just going to be the girl and say this, okay? And very insistent on it.
No, thank you for reminding me that, I mean, this is, so first of all, this is another aspect of the question of translation, because there's not only the translation into the Chinese context, but as you said, the translation into this anarchist feminist journal and this kind of distinct politics. And there's also a very direct connection to what Ken was talking about in terms of, once again, this problematic relationship between politics and social relations, in the sense that gender is very much a factor in the constitution of labor power, is very much a factor in the reproduction of surplus populations. And so in this sense, gender is directly implicated in the dynamics of capitalist development that Ken was describing, and then and necessarily becomes a component of an emancipatory politics, which has to in some way understand and intervene in those relations. So I thank you for emphasizing that. That has to be central to the discussion.
I would also just to add to this, to the question that I want to hear more about from Rebecca and also thinking of a way to somehow articulate the problem of class domination and patriarchal domination, in some common theoretical or historical discourse. And what I was thinking about as I was listening to Rebecca's talk about the period, say, between 1905 and 1908, with this anarchist feminist journal going all out anti-patriarchal at that moment, 1905, 1908. And I think in the case, say, like of neighboring Japan, around the same time we have, we have these discourses and debates on so-called feudality, as part of the problem of how to define even capitalism in Japan at that time, which is really the topic also of Gavin's book, his first book, The Sublime Perversion, on the debate on capitalism, which kind of alerts us to this huge political debate in Japan, which I would think also would resonate in many ways in the case of China, not only in 1904, 5 to 8, but also later in the 1920s and 30s, which was this debate in Japan where the Comintern, Soviet Union Comintern, said that Japan was not ready for a socialist revolution because they were still mired in these feudal remnants arguably of the feudal patriarchal system, which is also a landlord system, and that we need to get rid of basically the emperor and the feudal structure and that whole patriarchal system, as it were, and have a revolutionary democratic revolution, and then basically have the equivalent of a 1905 in Russia revolution, but have it in Japan, and then get ready for the proletarian dictatorship and the socialist revolution. And so I find it really this kind of complex space around that time of this question of patriarchal forms of despotism combined with feudality. And the point that I want to make, and then I'll just stop, is that I think when we think of that period, 1905 to 1908, it's also where we need, I think, to better articulate, better, for example, than the Comintern did or the debaters on capitalism in Japan, to articulate better how that moment of feudality, what Uno Kozo called feudality, with all of its, barbaric forms of oppression, is actually something that coexists quite profitably alongside the highest levels of capitalist development now in the stage of what Lenin called imperialism, which is dominated by finance capital. And I think that we can somehow see that in the case of Japan and these countries that developed capitalism after after England, that these problems persisted all the way, even to the contemporary moment. Arguably that they have not really, in Japan, we could say audaciously that they haven't quite really had an experience of modernity as it's often stereotypically portrayed. It's actually still locked in these feudal remnants, including these forms of oppression, but that these forms of oppression have emerged at a very historical conjuncture of the historical development of capitalism, where globally speaking, it's shifting from liberal capitalism and laissez-faire into this new stage where it's much, much more violent and ruthless and dominated now by a different form of capital than the time of Marx in industrial England, where it was dominated by industrial capital. Now it's dominated by finance capital, and yet we still have these remnants of oppression that Uno called a kind of feudality. And I would say that it's not only the question of patriarchal oppression, but of also racial oppression. At exactly the same time, we see W.E.B. Du Bois writing about capitalism in the US right after the Civil War in the Reconstruction period, and noting the persistence of these slave forms of oppression of Black people. And he says, after the Reconstruction, when there was a moment where the Black proletariat really had an advantage, had power, and yet it was betrayed in this new moment of what he calls, I think, feudal imperialism, or a new mode of feudalism in imperialism. This, it seems to me, is something, say, Lenin, didn't really talk about, but in his theory of imperialism. But I think my thinking lately is that, and partly also, again, in conversation with Gavin on these questions, is that we need to somehow rethink the theory of imperialism. For example, after rethink it, for example, in relation to Hartenegri's empire, again, still go back to this comparison and to rethink it. that maybe we haven't, that, not all the accounts have been settled on this question. And I think these questions of anti-patriarchy and anti-Black racism, especially, are symptoms of this feudality in imperialism that's dominated by finance capital. And therefore, we can kind of periodize these problems a little bit better, or to really somehow better grasp the historical truth of that history as something that truly must be overcome, like truly must be overcome in revolutionary transition. Absolutely we cannot have a revolution without overthrowing patriarchy or patriarchal forms of domination and things of that nature. So I just wanted to add to respond to Rebecca's comment and to Asad's kind of comment to the comment, and try to also situate that problem overall in China in 1905 and 1908 in somewhat of a larger context. That's all I wish to have done.
Okay, we have some questions coming in. So the first one is for Rebecca, which is, it says, can you speak to the more recent acts of repression of feminists in China, as well as broader strategies of, I think, repression of feminists, and will you place it into historical context?
Yeah, well, I mean, the repression of feminists is following in contemporary China is following is on the same level as the repression of Marxists as well. So, I mean, and I am going to refuse to decouple feminism and Marxism because I really do want to retrieve a moment 100 and some years ago when they were not opposed to one another, where it wasn't class or patriarchy, but it was class and patriarchy at the same time. And then we know that the history of the Chinese Communist Party was to subordinate feminist and patriarchal concerns to class concerns and to the seizure of state power. But so I want to be clear that in contemporary China, any kind of Marxism that does not toe a party line, and any kind of feminism that is not state-sponsored, gets repressed, and as do many other kinds of insurgencies or many other kinds of critiques of contemporary society. If you want to discuss labor, class struggle, if you want to discuss the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or the Tibetans in Tibet, or religious persecutions and so on, all of that gets repressed. And so, yes, feminists are being there's been the kind of feminism that's being repressed in China today, and it is being repressed very, very fundamentally. But the kind of feminism that's being repressed is very much it's not even a very radical one. It's a very liberal version. It's a very liberal type of feminism. So, historically, feminists were subordinated to a very rigid conceptualization of class struggle and class politics, where gendered concerns after the 1928 split between the communists and the nationalists, that were specifically gendered concerns, were understood to be splittist or divisionary. They divided from the main task, which was the seizure of state power by the Communist Party. And figures such as Ding Ling and so on, who tried very hard to insist on a certain form of feminist politics within the Communist Party, were repressed. I mean, they were sent to learn more about class struggle and less about gender struggle. So the point of what I wanted to do today was to think about this moment, this moment in the past when Marxism and feminism were thought as one and the same struggle rather than as separate struggles. And I think we need, as Ken just said very clearly, and I think we can all agree, I mean, these are indivisible. We cannot do sequential revolutions. You know, we can't wait for the anti-capitalist revolution to resolve patriarchy. It doesn't happen. Patriarchy doesn't get resolved as a natural consequence of anti-capitalism, and we know that. So yeah, thanks for the question.
So a kind of pairing of questions for Ken. The first is, well, I think we know the answer to this already, which is, do you see anything distinctive about Uno Kozo's theory of crisis? Presumably you do, but maybe you can say what that is. This questioner also asks about the relation to the presentation that's been given by Makoto Ito in English. And I think we can batch it with a question which is about what is the relationship between the act of selling one's labor power to ideology?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Uno Kozo's theory of crisis was published in 1953 in Japanese after 1 year after the end of the US occupation of Japan, at a time when there was really a lot of worker struggles, movements for the democratization of land and so on, but also the time Stalin was publishing stuff on the theory of value. And Uno took quite a different line from the Soviet Union's Marxist theory, and his theory of crisis is really indicative of just how different he is from the kind of dogmatic Soviet Comintern theories of crisis. And basically, the simple way to put it would be the first generation of Marxist theories of crisis coming out of the First and Second Internationals and so on, they all look to volume 2 of Das Kapital and its reproduction schemes, right? Between the departments of the production of the means of production and the department of the means of consumption, production of the means of consumption. And Marx showed how that they basically have this natural disequilibrium, and only theoretically we can show that it's in equilibrium. And Uno flatly rejects this approach to Marx's theory of crisis. He says we shouldn't look at the reproduction schemes of volume 2 to answer the question, and this is the key point, how do we demonstrate as Marxists the inevitability of capitalist crisis? And Uno's critique of the volume 2 followers of the theories of crisis is that they only show the possibility of crisis because, why? They're only talking about the circulation of products of labor, which are bought and sold, just like in any other generic commodity economy. But what's different about capitalism, he says, is that we're not just talking about a generic commodity economy of products of labor. We're also talking about the commodification of labor power, which produces these products of labor, which are then sold on the market. So Uno says we should look rather to the question of the commodification of labor power as the kind of founding detonation of contradictions that results in the phenomenon of capitalist crisis. That's one point. A second point would be and Ito Makoto, also one of Uno's students, also emphasizes the following point, which is that unlike other theories of crisis in Marxist discourse, for example, theories of the falling rate of profit, which is really located within the production process, which shows that as wages rise, then the profit rate will tendentially fall, right, and lead to crisis. Well, Uno then has another critique of that approach where he says, yes, that's really crucial. It's definitely a locale of the detonation of crisis. However, he then adds by emphasizing the fact that this tendency of the falling rate of profit actually is not something that you can just witness, with your own naked eyes, right? It's a tendency that's kind of hidden, especially by what Uno calls these exuberant speculations of commercial capitalists who speculate on the prices of these produced commodities. And he says that speculative process will lead to a situation where they will jack up the prices so much that eventually the capitalists can't sell the commodities at those desirably high prices, and then they will fail to sell them, and then you're going to have basically a whole shitload of unsold commodities. And then it appears that crisis is caused by not being able to sell these commodities which have been produced. But what happens after that, Uno says, is the bankers in the banking system, and that's where Uno's kind of a specialist, he'll say the bankers then will compensate for this fact that they can't sell all the stuff and will jack up the interest rates, which will affect the capitalist industrialists' investments and their loans, and they won't be able to pay back the loans. So Uno is saying that, this falling rate of profit is actually not really an object of conscious thought, but it becomes obvious only when the falling rate of profit will collide with rising interest rates, creating this frozen reproduction cycle. So Uno basically rejects the so-called, the theory of crisis based on the realization question and the reproduction schemes of volume 2, but he also challenges a bit the theory of crisis based in the falling rate of profit, because he argues that it often doesn't take into account these key questions related to financing of industrial capital by the banks and by these greedy, speculative, avaricious commercial capitalists, and so on. So he instead says, I'm going to actually explain why both of these problems happen, and they come from this, original problem of labor power becoming turned into a commodity, which enables the exploitation process where the profit rate would eventually fall, but it's also the condition for the production of all these commodities that circulate in the reproduction schemes of volume 2. And therefore, he says we need to look beyond the phenomenal appearance of these two areas, one in production, one in circulation, and recognize that between them, there's a kind of fundamental bridge that unites them, that allows both phenomena to happen, and that's the commodification of labor power. And therefore, he says the fundamental cause of crisis, of inevitable crisis, not just possible crisis, but inevitable crisis, is based on the commodification of labor power, which is also the founding act, if you will, of the capitalist mode of production, according to Marx. Therefore, the theory of crisis, Marx's theory of crisis a la Uno, shows that Marx showed pretty much that capitalist crisis is totally inevitable, which shows that, and we can show this theoretically as a kind of vicious cycle based on the commodification of labor power, and that why do we bother to demonstrate the inevitability of crisis? It's to show fundamentally that the bourgeois class cannot manage and govern the society that it is created under the rules of the capitalist mode of production, that it cannot solve this problem. In fact, it will endlessly perpetuate and reproduce capitalist crisis as a modus operandi of the capitalist mode of production itself. And the final point would be, therefore, we can never expect capitalist crisis itself to be, the collapse of capitalist society. It's unfortunately, more inconsolably, more perversely, it's actually the modus operandi of this mode of production, and that therefore a real collapse of this system can only be brought about by the organization of the proletariat to ultimately take control of this mode of production that has been left to the anarchical movement of prices and things like that. So that's, I think, what distinguishes Uno's theory of crisis from what we often have. And the second question of selling labor power and its relation to ideology, it's an incredible question. What can I say? I think I could say that selling labor power as a commodity is like selling any other commodity, which is that there's no guarantee someone's going to buy it. But ideologically, you may think someone may buy it, but the truth is there's no guarantee someone will buy it. In other words, selling labor power as a commodity is basically no different than praying to God. Or in other words, the relation between commodity and money, remember for Marx, that money, the form of money originally comes out of the form of the commodity. And the form of money is like a transcendental signifier of all earthly commodities. So if you're a worker selling labor power as a commodity, you still got to try to reach the promised land, as it were, of money, which represents all commodities. And so Marx has a lot of passages about these kind of theological aspects. And basically the lesson I've learned is selling is praying. Selling is praying. And basically it's the relation to the big other. And that relation is, I think, deeply ideological in as much as it's almost like a religious experience. But basically, when you sell labor power, you're going to be hoping and praying, basically, hoping and praying for some God to redeem your value. But we've learned, don't wait on capital to be that God.
Okay, now this is for Rebecca. The question is, how was the internationalist character of the Communist Manifesto received by Chinese anarchism amidst a period of national liberation?
Well, I mean, there's multiple eras of national liberation in China. There was the moment in the late Qing in the first decade of the 20th century where the national liberation was understood to be about the liberation of Han China from the Manchu overlords. And so from the Qing dynastic overlords that was ruled by a Manchu elite. And so the original 1911 revolution, the Republican Revolution, was an anti-dynastic revolution, but it was also an ethnic revolution against the Manchus, and where that many were reconceptualized not as an internal colonizer of China, but as equivalent to the imperialist colonization that the British, the United States, Americans and Germans and so on were Japanese and so on were undertaking in China at the same time. And so that the Manchu, the theory of Manchu colonization was understood as in that equivalence. And in that sense, then the Communist Manifesto gave a certain kind of internationalism to what was an extraordinarily what was otherwise a relatively nationalist movement. What I mean by that is that China's movement in 1911 was understood to be part of a global anti-colonial movement that was then not so much Marxist as it was internationally mobilizing what were called oppressed peoples around the world. So Turks against Egyptians against Britain, Philippines against the United States, and so on and so forth. My first book discusses all of that. By the time you get to the 1920s and that national liberation struggle, then you have the existence of the Communist Party and of communism and Marxism as a systematic understanding of not only national but of class struggle and so on, but of global issues. And in that situation, then the Communist Manifesto is understood as a way to analyze the relationship of China's national struggle to the colonial question in the sort of Lenin Roy moment of debating out what is the relationship of national revolution to anti-colonial revolution. And in that sense, the Communist Manifesto is understood as a way to think about these issues. However, to get to your the other part of the question, however, by the time you get to the formation and the strengthening of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Communists declare all-out war against anarchists. And they purge the anarchists from the Communist Party, and anarchists, therefore, don't have a sort of political home. I mean, one would say that, of course, that doesn't bother them immensely since they never wanted to be organized to begin with, but they are persecuted then out of the Communist Party. And by the time you get to the 1930s in China, the anarchists have either been driven underground, they've emigrated, or quite remarkably, many of them have joined the right wing of the Nationalist Party as anti-communists. So they've been driven into the other wing of politics, which is a virulently anti-communist wing, which has no relationship to anarchism as a ideological, political, or future-oriented proposition. It's just that it's anti-communist. So the purge of the anarchists this happened in China, this happened everywhere. I mean, this is not merely Chinese. Communists were very, very anti-anarchist, no matter where they were. I mean, that started right after the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and continued very unabated throughout the history of communist parties. So the Communist Manifesto, the internationalism of the movements was very well articulated through the anarchist and the communist and Marxist analyses. And in that, they were very similar, but of course, their modes of political, their relationship to nationalism, their relationship to national liberation, their relationship to the Comintern, to the debates that Ken was talking about earlier, feudality and all the rest. I mean, add in the Trotskyists, who also had their own independent position and who were also a huge target, not only of anarchists, but of the Communist Party. You have a pretty complex revolutionary condition and situation in which the internationalism of the Communist Manifesto and the internationalism of revolutionary politics is well understood. But what that means for China is hard fought and very, very fraught.
So we have some questions which have a kind of broader convergence on asking how these discussions inform our understanding of politics in the present. They're framed in a couple of different ways. One framing was about this question of the relationship between different kinds of struggles, and having understood the limitations and failures of the idea in the past that there is a kind of sequence in which there is a socialist revolution and then the problems of gender or colonialism and so on are simply resolved. How do we draw lessons from that, from the limitations of that, and specifically is there, the questioner asks, do we have a universalist politics to turn to, or are we awaiting the reinvention of universalism? And then a kind of different angle on this was to ask if the way that Rebecca has framed a kind of masculine question, or I believe you call it functionalist, about the applicability of Marxism in China, whereas there was an alternative potentiality in the feminist approach to translation. What does that say about the possibility of Marxism being kind of re-emerging or becoming a force once again in China, for example, today, and more broadly being a condition of emancipatory politics in the 21st century? These are two angles, I think, on one kind of broad question.
Well, I would say, I wanted to say something about this issue of Marxist theory, especially this idea of the applicability. I probably shouldn't have even said that, but the applicability of capital for a place like China, say, or a place like Japan, say, and or say India, colonial India, let's say, and it's been a long history now that, especially in countries that have, I would say, developed capitalism after England, that clearly the conditions in these countries are different from those that Marx analyzed in the case of England between the 1820s and the 1860s, but with very different class compositions in those areas. But does that mean that that Marx's analysis, his pure theory of capital's logic, is not applicable? For example, there's a certain strong strain of post-colonial theory, like Kalyan Sanyal and Dipesh Chakrabarty, maybe, and some others, who would say, you know, the case in India shows that we can't really apply Marx's theory because, for example, primitive accumulation in India and rural India did not lead to an industrial labor force, but rather to this kind of ambiguous terrain between expropriation and exploitation. Therefore, the rules of capital's logic don't really apply. And there were cases in Japan where, you know, in the 30s that they would, you know, have huge discourses over whether it can be applied, because in the case of Japan, was manufacturing developed enough into large scale industry? Yes, no, etc. If it's no, then we can't apply. It's not really useful. It's not relevant to us in our situation in Japan. Well, someone like Uno just totally, you know, just destroys this kind of argumentation, because they fail to really understand the full utility of Marx's theory in Capital. And I think it needs to be emphasized, you know, and the way I've been thinking about it is strictly pragmatic, you know, that the theory of capital should be looked at as a pedagogical tool. I mean, it's a difficult pedagogical tool, yes. I mean, but in its pure logic, it's intended to be just a purely pedagogical device to show what? To show the laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production, to show the relations of production and the forms of exchange that correspond to it and its laws and tendencies, yes. But what the principles really show is that, and these are principles that Marx abstractly derived on the basis of analyzing the history of capitalism in England between 1820 and 1860s. And it's a logic that shows that these laws of capitalist society, that the conditions that will lead to their dissolution are the same conditions that have led to the establishment of capitalist society and these very laws and tendencies. So it's, I mean, for example, in my talk, I mentioned this kind of language that I'm using lately, talking about like labor power and the relative surplus population as a relative minor of capital. Okay, I know it sounds kind of corny, but in some ways it's really, I mean, someone like Uno Kozo and someone like Arnold Schoenberg in Vienna, they're really similar, basically, insofar as they want to say this is the pure theory. It shows that the conditions that lead to the dissolution of this system, like the tonal system in Schoenberg, like major minor distinction, this very distinction emerged historically, and we have to learn them as if they are eternal, but in fact they are not eternal, and we can actually overcome them. And I think Marx's theory in Capital of this logic is the same way. We learn about these principles so that we can grasp that what is truly eternal is only change itself, that we can change ourselves as we've come to know ourselves as these alienated selves. And these principles show us in an ideal way, or what Marx calls an ideal average, how capitalism works. And once we learn these laws, it can directly, I think, teach us how to think against the logic of capital, against its laws and tendencies. But we have to learn those laws and tendencies before we know what exactly it is about capitalism that we want to negate so much. And oftentimes we are not familiar with these laws, and we may basically attack the wrong enemy, and basically shoot the wrong person or something like that. I mean, so that's the purpose of theory, I think, that needs to be emphasized, especially in light of these kind of knee-jerk post-colonial critiques of capital as this Eurocentric, only tome of theory that has nothing to do with conditions in India, say, or Japan, or China, and therefore it's pretty much useless for us. Actually, no, they should be extremely useful, precisely in these contexts, to know what must be negated and what must be overcome in struggle, and taking into account local historical geographical conditions. But to navigate the mess of history, we need this theory to give us political direction and clarity, so that we can really analyze concrete problems that really must be eliminated. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have anything particularly else to say. I think Ken just articulated it very well. I mean, I hate when students tell me that they're going to apply theory to something. I mean, the whole idea of applicability makes me crazy. And I think that it's not, for me, that's why in my talk, I talk about reconceptualization. How do we use tools? How do we use tools for concepts that are historically indicated and historically relevant, to reconceptualize a past, not as a pure, in some genuine, more genuine way or anything, but as a way to conceptualize the politics that we want to engage in the present and in the future. And so, the sort of idea that Marx is not applicable to China because China is Chinese is I have my first chapter in my book Magic of Concepts is called A Critique of Pure Ideology, and that's what I call pure ideology. I mean, that is just pure ideology. Man, you've got a whole library at the ready there. Thank you very much. Anyway, so but to wrap up very, very quickly. I mean, we've been at this for a couple hours now, so let me just say that to address the question of feminist approaches to translation, it seems to me that once you've started to reconceptualize history in feminist terms, you also reconceptualize history in terms of various forms of oppression and so on. Now, not all of Marx and not all of feminism and not all of this is going to be relevant for all time in the same way. That's what we do. That's what we historians do, is to understand how certain kinds of theories speak to certain kinds of histories. And so it seems to me that we have to think really clearly, because China is never going to be Britain, and Japan is never going to be France, and China is never going to be Japan. So we can't expect that to be true. And therefore, does that mean then that we can only use Chinese words and concepts for Chinese history? That would be insane, because Chinese history has been global for forcibly so for at least 2 centuries, if not more. And so you have to, these issues are very hard fought and very fraught. I mean, Marxists of various stripes and various types have been fighting over these issues for over a century now. I mean, the discussions that Ken was talking about feudality, they happened in Japan, they happened in China, they happened in Korea, they happened in all numbers of places. As these older forms, older forms of social formation started to break apart, what then takes their place is the question. And how to analyze what takes their place and what that social formation is tending towards, and how it works, and so on. Not by displacing ultimately everything that it has found, but by reconfiguring what it has found into new forms. I mean, those are the essential questions, and those can be asked in the abstract, but they can only be solved in the concrete. They can only be solved historically. I think that's my version.
I would just say one other thing about something about Uno's method that is so related, I think, to the question of analyzing capitalism in Asia. And it kind of goes back to the question of theory and applicability, but also I wanted to come back to the question that we didn't talk about question of the relationship between different kinds of struggle, the question of the sequence of social revolution, and, is there some new universalism to think about? What I wanted to say was, it's like we have immediate struggles in our face, and then we think, how can Das Kapital, the text, help us navigate the immediacy of these struggles? And we may think if we read Capital, we can somehow learn the secret about the immediate struggles right in our backyard, in our face, on the street. Well, Uno's answer is no. This is risky to do that. Why? Because we are only operating on this kind of ideal logic with Das Kapital. And so what Uno did was, he said, for research, we need 3 levels of research. First level is just learn the logic, okay? Just learn, it's like Schoenberg teaching about harmony. Just learn the basics of the rules of the logic of the tonal system. But Marx says, learn the law of value, learn the law of profit, surplus value, law of populations, and so on, and all its tendencies. And then that's step 1. And then step 2 would be, we have also a method to analyze the history now of capitalism in its different stages: mercantilism, liberalism, and imperialism. And these stages, each stage is dominated by a different form of capital: merchant capital, industrial capital, finance capital. And we can then get a general idea of the whole history lifespan of capitalism as it emerges as a little baby with merchant capital, grows into industrial capital in the heyday of capitalism. And that's where Marx abstracts his theory. But then after the 1870s, and specifically after the 1873 crisis, we see this entry into this new stage called imperialism, dominated by finance capital. So then Uno says, now that we have step 1 of the abstract logic and step 2 of the stages of capitalism, world historically, we can then look at a concrete country like Japan that develops capitalism actually in the stage of imperialism, right when capitalism is kind of declining, as it were, from, or at least deviating from this industrial norm of the mid 19th century. Now it seems to be morphing into finance capital and so on. That's when Japan begins its entire journey to a capitalist society. And that can help us, this fact can then also help us to periodize these stages within a certain country, like Japan. So they would have their period of merchant capital from the Meiji Restoration of 1868 to about 1890, he says. Then after this period of long expropriation of peasants and so on, and the state basically dominating this development, then they introduce laissez-faire policies for 20 years because they have a corner basically on the cotton market internationally. So they promote laissez-faire for 20 years and make a ton of money, and also have two wars, one with China and one with Russia. And as a result of those two wars, we have an infusion of capital into Japan, and it turns into its own stage of imperialist development in Japan, with all of its morbid symptoms, including these feudal remnants, which actually aren't even that old, if you think about it. They've just persisted in many levels of society, but especially on a kind of ideological and customary, if you will, a level of habits and practices and so on. So that's one way then to think about these different kinds of struggles, I think, that we need to be historical about. We can't just jump into the present analysis. We can't, on the other hand, we can't simply use an abstract logic. So we create a kind of periodization of capitalism. And then on top of that, I think what Asad has really always emphasized is not only these economic stages, but even political sequences that would have some rough correspondence to these economic stages, but we need to look at the autonomy of these political sequences themselves. But I think it's useful to kind of, put these two periodizations, if you will, together, the economic and then the political sequences. They won't be perfectly matched, but they can help us then better, I think, navigate problems of the present. And if there's anything about universalism that I've learned, is obviously it's about the proletariat, but at the center of the proletariat is this concept of labor power. And I guess for me, that's the ultimate universal category in some ways in Marx's text, to think about the proletariat and what we have to do with our labor power. And it's not to simply surrender it to the exploitative capitalists, but we should really use and share our labor power with each other against capital. That's the point, I think, and somehow get to that question of rule and government of the proletariat. So,
well, thank you to Ken and Rebecca, and I turn it over to Philip to see us off.
Hey, thank you, everybody. That was a terrific series of talks. Rebecca starting off by saying she didn't want to go after Ken because of his rhetorical power. I've never heard a celebration of the pure logic of capital in that kind of passionate rhetoric before. It makes me want to talk just about that for another hour and to hear more, but of course we can't. But it does seem that we've had Michael Heinrich here earlier, and if you put together Uno Kozo, who I don't know very well, obviously, but Heinrich and Althusser, and you try to find people who have found some sort of use for a pure logical level of let's say the capitalist mode of production, who keep that separate from some notion of historical formation, and then at another level deal with conjunctures. There seems to be some sort of commonality here. and I was trying to answer, sitting around trying to explain to Michael Hart the other day why I found Michael Heinrich's way of formulating it useful. And Michael listened and said, so you see it as a way of talking to a non-Marxist to explain why Marxist theory is why your good capitalism, bad capitalism notion won't work, or something like that. We were talking on that level, but it's very hard to even explain what you just did for 10 amazing minutes that held me spellbound. So we need to continue this discussion with everybody at some other point. I want to thank Rebecca and Ken and Asad for putting this all together, and it was just amazing. And I should quickly, before we go, just do my announcement of what's going on tomorrow and the next day, so people who clued in late and might not have heard me going on about this at the beginning will know. But as you can probably imagine, I can't find out on my computer where it is. Okay, here we go. Whoops, no, I'm on week 1 now. Okay, I'm gonna get this right. And of course, my screen is stuck. Okay, well, we have critical theory in the 21st century, and that would be tomorrow at 11. Is that right, Maheen? I think so. And then tomorrow evening, what do we have? Oh, well, no, that's on Friday. Okay, well, go to our website and I will give a more thorough bill of fare tomorrow morning. Thank you all for watching. This was a really scintillating discussion.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I guess we'll see you guys.